This is Close Encounters. Close Encounters. True stories, real people. Close Encounters on Cross Rhythms.
Yes, hello and welcome to Close Encounters with me, Anne Donaldson. Today my guest is the Reverend George White, and George is married to Kate, and they have two young sons, Isaiah and Malachi. George is a priest, a poet and a musician, and he's vicar of St. Wilfrid's in Nottingham. So welcome to Close Encounters, George.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invite.
So you are into music big time. You write, record and release music under the name Trev. I think your love of music goes back a long way. Do you want to tell us a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Well, well, Trev, where the name came from, my dad was Trevor, and so called Trev, and it happens to be my middle name. And I like that there was something very, I know it's Welsh, but something very British, isn't there, about Trev, and simple and straightforward. And for some reason, I just thought it'd be a good name for the when I started releasing music in 2016. But yeah, so I grew up in Kent, just near the coast, not far from Folkestone, actually in a little village between Folkestone and Canterbury, and had two parents who were amazing, who, loved one another and loved us, which is, I realise as I get older, probably like others, that actually isn't a given, is it? So that was amazing. And I have one older brother called Douglas, who's a year and a half older than me, and he hates it when these days he gets mistaken for the younger brother. Absolutely hates it, which happens more and more. But so that was my family context. Grew up in this, very fortunate, had a really wonderful childhood, and was surrounded by, neither of my parents were musicians actually, so they didn't play, but my dad in particular was a huge music lover, so there was vinyl everywhere, and some records I think he was a bit embarrassed about that he bought on a spare of the moment in the 60s, and others that he was a bit more proud of. So when I was growing up, often on a Saturday morning, they'd have Pink Floyd playing, or Led Zeppelin, or Fleetwood Mac, and I think I only appreciate now that I had a real amazing musical education because of that. And so my dad was a big music lover, but my mum loved words, and so actually some of my earliest memories are of my mum and me swapping little poems in the house. And so this kind of love of words and love of music, I've only realized this recently, like we're both there quite early on, and so poetry and music for me is sort of as just probably grown out of that over the years. Yeah.
So was it music at the expense of the rest of your education, or were you enjoying education generally growing up?
I was enjoying education. It was so funny. I was at a meeting last night where I was asked if I liked school or not, and I think my answer was I did really like school. I think I'd always have preferred not to be there and to be playing music instead. So I didn't like it so much that I wouldn't rather be at rehearsal. But you know what? No, actually, in the early years, school was a big part. Actually, I was very fortunate school was a big part of encouraging both music and poetry in me. So particularly secondary school, I had this amazing teacher called Richard Swan, who was an English literature teacher, and he had obviously somehow just perceived that I loved words and loved lyrics and poems. And one day I came into class and he had bought me this huge collection of poetry books, T.S. Eliot and Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and Philip Larkin, all of the kind of classic poets. And so it was moments like that where people, when you're young, someone sees you and they see something you care about and they invest in it, and that just sort of, continues to sort of put fuel on the fire. So no, I liked school. I must admit, when I then later on in secondary school, I'm not sure I should admit this, but I think my attendance for 1 year of sixth form was about 60% because I spent so much time in rehearsal and playing gigs in school time. So there you go.
So when you say you were playing gigs, were you part of a group? Had you got a group, a band?
Yeah, I started playing with bands, I think, my first instrument is actually drums, so I play all sorts of different things now, and in Trev I predominantly play guitar and sing, but my first instrument was drums. And so the joke is that as soon as I could hold down a beat, although I don't even know if I was doing that very well, as soon as that happened I wanted to make a band. So the first bands I was in, I think if I were to look back now, would have been awful, but yeah, so and then I started playing in other bands, and then particularly when I was sort of around 15, 16 years old, I started getting into bands with guys who are a fair bit older than me. So guys in their early 20s, and I was still in school. And those bands started, that was when for the first time we were getting signed and releasing records and going on tour. So I actually remember I was in my GCSEs, and I remember we were on tour in the middle of my exams. And so I managed to do all of my exams, but one particular exam, I remember putting the pencil down and then running out to the train station to then meet the band back on tour in Plymouth, actually, funnily enough. So it was amazing. Unfortunately, I had a assistant head teacher at the time at my school who was in a band himself, who was signed to EMI for a very short period.
Wow.
I don't know if he'd be able to do it these days, but at the time he was very gracious and was able to authorize a lot of the sort of the absences that I had. So
it sounds, when you look back on life, isn't it amazing? You see these influences, and the time you perhaps don't realise what impact it's having, but there's the support, there's the resources, there's the encouragement. It's just lovely, isn't it, how these things are placed?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, totally. And you often don't appreciate it, do you? You don't see how all the threads come together until you're older. And I look now, and I've got kids of my own, I sort of think, gosh, it was actually, you can see all along how these sort of little nuggets of things were kind of, stirring hobbies and passions and things like that in me. So amazing.
So was your home a church home? Was it, were your parents people who went to church, or you talked about God at all?
No, so we didn't grow up around church. Very occasionally we might go to the local church. I'm talking, every other Easter or something, but we wouldn't, neither of my parents would have called themselves Christians. No. And it certainly wasn't part. I joke with people that are kind of the equivalent of church for me growing up was probably the local pub, the village pub, because that was where, that was a lot of the community, and, where Dad in particular used to, so I used to joke he was like the mayor of Elam, where I grew up, because he'd walk in the pub and he'd know everyone. And anyway, so that was my background.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. And I think probably this is a good time to listen to your first choice of song. And would you like to introduce and tell us why you've chosen it?
Yeah, well, so this first song is called How He Loves. It's by John Mark McMillan, who's one of my favourite songwriters still. And it's actually, I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but it's one of the first Christian songs I remember listening to. And I think I found it, beautiful, but also just very honest as well. And the story that goes with it is really captivating. So, yeah, John Mark McMillan, I'm a big fan. And this song is continue to be a favourite.
Thank you.
Transformations.
Cross Rhythms.
You're listening to Close Encounters. I'm Anne Donaldson, and my guest today is the Reverend George White. So you were telling us before the song about how you would get off and go off to gigs with people a lot older than you. What sort of influence was that having on you as a young man?
Well, the first band I was in with people that were older than me were only slightly older. So I was in school, I think they were a couple of years above me. But I don't know if you remember being that age, it feels like quite a lot when you're in school. And so latterly, I then started playing in bands with guys who there was an even bigger gap, and were sort of post school. But yeah, that band, I had a group of friends, and we played basically sort of post-hardcore music, so very heavy music. All of us were listening to bands like Under Oath and Devil Wears Prada, and as well as lots of other stuff. And so we were in that band together, and one of the guitar players, a guy called Jack, was a Christian. And so the general influence was that I was just loving being in a band, but there was also my friend Jack, who it's funny because I remember at the time, and I think others in the band would have said this, there was just something particularly magnetic about him. And he wasn't even an extrovert or particularly outgoing. He certainly wasn't the loudest. He was probably the most introverted out of all of us, actually, but you just wanted to be around him. And I didn't, obviously at the time we don't have any language for that before I was a Christian, but I sort of realized now that there was something more going on. But Jack one year invited us, I think all of us in the band, to go to this summer camp basically that his church went to. And my memory of it is that we all said, oh, thanks but no thanks. And then like if I'm getting this right, he then sort of started saying about oh, there's also a skate park there, and we all skateboard at the time. So we were like, oh, interesting, but still no thanks. And then he said, oh, and it's really cheap. And we said, oh, that's interesting, but no thanks. And then he sort of kept going on like this until I think the final offer, from what I remember, was that there's a skate park. It's really cheap. We can bring our guitars, and you don't have to go to any of the Christian stuff. And so we were like, great. So me and the I was playing drums in this band. Me and then the other guitar player did end up going along, and we went to this place, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but there was like 6,000 people camping, in this random place, all kind of there because they had faith, presumably, and I just remember finding it wild. Why would people spend the sunniest weeks of the summer holidays kind of camping in a field, and talking about God? And so I remember the first time I walked into one of the tents, and I think it was for sort of older youth, something like that. And there was this tent full of people, and there was this rock band at the front sort of playing songs, and all of these teenagers with their hands in the air. And I was like, what on earth is this? And from my memory, I think I ran out. I was just like, I have no idea. I have no context for this. Didn't own a Bible. Didn't have, know any of that stuff. But throughout the week, I think I became a bit more curious. And so I would start popping my head into things where people were speaking and but kind of sitting, I don't know if kind of sitting on the threshold of the door so I could leave at any moment, and probably thought I was a bit too cool for it all. And then the Thursday night, so I'd sort of been a bit curious, and the Thursday night I heard a woman speak about Jesus. And, I went to a Church of England primary school. I was vaguely aware of Christianity. I knew a few of the hymns, but I don't think I'd ever clocked that at its heart Christianity was about this man, Jesus. And so I didn't own a Bible. I didn't know any of the songs. I didn't have a local church, but I was like, if this is what Christianity is about, I'm in. I don't even really know what that means, but I'm in. And so I went forward for prayer and got prayed for by someone. And as he laid hands on me and prayed for me, I collapsed. And I remember, fortunately, someone caught me. So someone must have expected this might happen. I certainly didn't. And I remember it felt about 2 minutes, and I saw Jesus walking towards me in my mind's eye, and with me was my mum, who we can get into this if you like later, but she had died when I was 9 years old, and she actually became a Christian a year before she died. And I remember the Lord saying, your mum's with me, now you follow me. And I sat up after this experience, and I remember feeling like it was about 2 minutes, and I sat up and the tent had almost cleared, and it had been about 45 minutes.
Wow.
And I was in tears, and I was particularly annoyed about that because there were 3 girls that I was trying to impress because I really wanted to. I remember and obviously I'd been collapsed out on the floor, and then when I sat up, I was just weeping and weeping and weeping. And so that night I said, look, I still don't really know what this involves, but I'm in. I'm captivated, and if this is about Jesus, then I'm in.
Wow, what an experience. And so from then on, your faith has just grown and grown and grown.
Yeah. I would say, although that moment was incredibly powerful, I was still a teenager, and so in those early years in particular, I made all sorts of compromises, and I knew I had this faith and I cared about it. But it was probably when I was then 17, a few years later, where I really decided, look, I've got to go all in. And it was that lots of people talk about this, but it was that C.S. Lewis quote that got me, if Christianity is true, it's of infinite importance. If it's not true, it's of no importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. And I just remember feeling like, I've had this moment, but I'm sort of treating it like it's just, I'm sitting on the fence essentially still. And so actually it was later on when I sort of said, you know what, like there's a whole story behind that, but I'm all in. And that was when I actually got baptized when I was 17, and have been all in for Jesus ever since.
That's wonderful. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. So we're going to listen to your next choice of song, and you've chosen Death Defying Joy. So we're going to listen to that now. Thank you. Yes, this is Close Encounters with me, Anne Donaldson, and my guest today is George White. And George, we heard that beautiful account of your encounter with Jesus as a teenager. But you'd also referred to your mum dying when you were a young boy. I'm sure that must have been a real challenge for you.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I kind of, I am, and I'll come on to this in a moment, but I actually, at this point in my life, both my parents are no longer around. And, it's this dual thing, and with both of their stories where it was incredibly hard. But both of them are wrapped up in these incredible stories of God meeting with them both. And so there is genuinely, and I'll not just say it, there's this grief and joy. And actually, like I said earlier, I was really fortunate. I had an amazing childhood. Mm-hmm. And although, that it was cut short on both accounts, I have many friends who, some of them, you never knew one of their parents, or you know what I mean? They're
yes.
Incredibly difficult situations. So I went to a wonderful little church in the primary school. And my mum was actually a teaching assistant there. And that early point in my life, we actually experienced, I think, for when I was quite young, there was quite a few experiences of tragedy and death. And there was a young girl in my brother's class who I think a year before my mum died, very sadly died as well of cancer. And her parents were and are devout believers. And she, the little girl's name was Sasha, loved Jesus as well. And there's a whole story behind that. And that was incredibly tragic. And then about a year after that, my mum, who had had cancer for about 18 months, she died. So I was 9 at that point and my brother was 10. And I miss your mum. It's it's one of the hardest things that can happen. And yet what I also say is that I think that the sort of spiritual awakening that sort of then happened in our family, where I became to faith as a teenager, and then latterly my dad came to faith, really was started by my mum, because about a year before she died, she literally she was in a hospital room in Canterbury, and Jesus showed up to her in the hospital room.
Wow.
So she was someone, she didn't have a religious background. She actually had a very difficult, abusive childhood. She ran away from home as a teenager, and I think in her life, I think had various sort of forays into sort of spiritual things. And I think had gone at different times for tarot card readings and had got involved in all sorts of that stuff. So someone who was spiritual, open to that.
Yes.
But wouldn't have called themselves a Christian. And so, about a year before she died, she's in a hospital room, and Jesus shows up to her, and she becomes Christian in that moment, right in that moment, in a hospital room. And my aunt, who her older sister, my auntie Lizzie, who had become a Christian in her 20s, I think a little way before that, she actually, the day this happened, my aunt then came in to see my mum, and my mum was sat there crying, and she apparently said to my mum, Jeanette, why are you crying? And she said, Jesus is here. Jesus was here, and now all I want to do is be with him.
Wow.
And it was an incredibly powerful moment. And it's like, I know this sounds like something from a movie, but the story of how this happened was actually recounted to my auntie, who wrote it down for me. And I received this as a letter years later of what actually happened in that moment for my mum. And so obviously mum had this moment of encountering God, someone who wasn't religious, someone who wasn't, from that background. Jesus just showed up in her life. And I remember actually the night that she died, as a 9-year-old, I remember vividly going to see her and her having this extraordinary peace. I just remember I can even remember now, blazing in my mind, just this sense of like, she just seemed to know everything was going to be okay, not just for her, but for us as well. And obviously, I didn't have any Christian language put around that. Later on, it's like, it's the peace that surpasses all understanding, and that's what Jesus does, and all the rest of it. At the time, I just remember being bewildered by it. Here's my mum suffering, and yet she just seems to have this unbelievable peace for herself and for us. And that made a mark on me big time. And I think then years later, when I did become a Christian, I think probably something had started in my heart at that point.
Yeah, wow. So you also had an experience with your dad as well, and having the opportunity, you now being a follower of Jesus, you now have the opportunity to share with him.
Yeah, so that was again, that was wild. My dad was my best mate. I often joke that if he was around when my wife Kate and I got married, he would have been my best man. I mean, he's just was the most amazing guy. And so yeah, so after I became a Christian, obviously, and there'll be people who are listening who relate to this, you pray and pray and pray, don't you, for the people that you love that don't know him, because it changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. It's like life going from black and white to technicolor, and you're just like, I just want everyone to know. And so I've been praying for him and my older brother. And I had actually, at this point, I had moved to London to study theology. So there's a whole story behind that. But I was playing music and then felt God call me into Christian ministry. And so I went to London to start studying theology. And on my first break back from university around Easter time, I remember I was sat at the dinner table with my dad in our house. And I think Antiques Roadshow was on in the background, and one of those sort of 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. daytime TV that, you know what I'm talking about. And so, and I remember my dad, he just sat there at the table, and I remember him muting the TV and saying to me, you know, when you first, you know, became a Christian, I thought it was just helping you deal with your mum, and obviously I've been supportive, but I've never really understood it. And my dad just said to me, you know, you've just got to tell me, you know, you're now in London studying theology, this is what you want to do with your life, like, what's it all about? And I realized that I'd probably spent so much time talking to my dad about sort of clever philosophical things and, you know, and arguments for God and all this kind of stuff, that I'd never really just thought to tell him my story. And so I just recounted what Jesus had done in my life, and all the way from, you know, that what I believe he'd done in Mum's life and all the rest of it. And at the end of that conversation, my dad, he was 65 at this point, he looked over the top of his glasses and he just said in his very southern sort of accent, you know, well, I think I better give that a go then. And so we prayed. We sat at my table and we prayed. And my dad got a Bible and he began to develop this relationship with God. And 3 months later, he died. So he had been sick for quite a while. We didn't know he was going to die 3 months later. But yeah, 3 months after that moment, he died. So that was 2013, and I was 20 when that happened.
Wow, yeah. And so you've had these challenges, and yet you talk about the peace and you talk about the joy, and it's something the world doesn't understand. And yet when we follow Jesus, like you say, he's the peace that the world can't understand, but he is the Prince of Peace. That's wonderful. Yeah. So could you introduce your next choice of song, George? You've chosen Grace by Marcus Mumford.
Yeah, I'm a massive Mumford & Sons fan, and Marcus Mumford released a solo record a few years ago now, and this is the second track on that. One of the best albums, I think, of the last 5 years, by the way. But I chose this, and really that's the story of my life. It's the story, isn't it, of every Christian's life. Grace, but the grace of Jesus to show up to my mum when she was least expecting to meet with him, the grace of God to show up in my life when I was skeptical and cynical, the grace of God to show up in my dad's life. It's just who he is. So that's why I've chosen Grace.
Thank you. Welcome back to Close Encounters on Cross Rhythms with me, Anne Donaldson. My guest today is the Reverend George White. And George, you were saying about having that call to go to theological college in London. And tell us a little bit about that, how that unfolded.
Well, yeah, so I sort of started to sense this call towards that I was supposed to work for the church, and at the time I was still playing music lots, and when I first sensed that, I kind of thought, I've been brainwashed, I don't want to do that, you know, of, you know, that's not something that's kind of, as far as I was concerned, I wanted to, follow Jesus and be in the music industry, and that was kind of what I wanted to do. And then as often happens, it just kept nagging away at me. So I finally said, okay, if this is what I'm supposed to do, I'll do it. And I thought, what do people do that work for churches? Well, they sort of, go study a bit of theology. And so I ended up studying theology at a place in London that's closed now, actually. It's called Heathrow College, and it was a Jesuit college. So it was part of the University of London, but it also trained lots of Catholic ordinands, and it had a convent on site and, excuse me, all kinds of things. And so I had some very well-meaning people from the church that I was at who loved me very much, who were very concerned about me going to this place, and sort of said, no, you shouldn't go there. And I think, because they were worried that it might not be the best formation for me. They loved me and they cared for me, but I really felt God called me there. And what I encountered there were people who really loved Jesus, and I learned an awful lot from the people that I met there. But the reason I share that as well is because not far from where I studied, which was on High Street, Kent in West London, was a little church called HTB, which was I say little church, I think it had 5,000 or 6,000 people when I went there. But I walked to this place, hadn't really been part of an Anglican church before. I just really felt God say, for this season, this is home. And I'm so glad he did, because I also met my wife there in the student group. And so, two of my best friends to this day, my friends Ollie and Johnny, and their wives as well. Anyway, so many streams flow back to being at that church for wonderful. Me. And so that's where Kate and I met. And during my time there that people started saying, have you ever thought about getting ordained in the Church of England? And that sort of started me on that long process of God sort of calling me into this part of the church. But yeah, met my wife Kate there, and I remember, I think it's fair to say that I had a few relationships that probably weren't great in my teenage years, and I just remember going all in for God in my late teens, and just saying to God, the next person I meet, I want them to love Jesus more than I want them to inspire me in my faith. Not, I want them to be someone where it's like, I would meet them like, I want to love Jesus like you do, someone that kind of grows you and inspires you. And I met Kate, and she exactly that, continues to be that, has taught me as much about God and grace as anyone. So we live in Nottingham now. We've got 2 young boys, 4-year-old called Isaiah and a 1-year-old called Malachi. So you can tell they're church kids, can't you? Yeah. Isaiah and Malachi. But yeah, becoming a dad 4 years ago, as it often does, just opened up faith to me in a whole new way. I think, I love my kids. I remember a friend of mine saying, he's a church leader in Bath, but I remember him saying when he had his first child that it's like having a surgical operation where someone takes your heart out of your chest and puts legs on it, and it walks around in front of you. And I totally agree. It's like, the love, but also the kind of the weight of feeling, you just don't know what you'd do if anything happened to them. And it's a whole different thing, isn't it, that you don't know until you know. And so yeah, and I think it's made me reflect on as well, just God's longing for people, because throughout the scriptures it talks about that God identifies himself as a father. And I experienced towards my kids this unbelievable love. Like, you can't put words to it, you can't explain it to people. You could write albums of music and you wouldn't come close to sort of capturing it. And yet we're told that God loves people even more than that. So even more than the love that I have for my kids is how God feels about every single person, which is why Christ died for them. And so for me, I think it's just that it's also heightened just that sense of longing to see people come home. That's really the only reason I do my job. Like, the only reason I'm a vicar, the only reason I get out of bed in the morning is because I want to see people come to know Jesus. I want to see people come home. And I often joke with friends of mine who aren't Christians, that they sort of, I often say to them, I love you, and and we're good friends, but you just need to know I do have an agenda. I think your life would be immeasurably better if you follow Jesus. That's been my experience, and so that's what I will give my life to now for the rest of my days, is trying to help people to discover Jesus and come home. That's all I want.
Yeah, and George, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the people who are going to be listening, who perhaps don't yet know that love, that all-consuming love that is expressed to us from God through the person of Jesus Christ. And so I echo what you're saying. There's a better way. People go through life struggling in their own strength, battered by circumstances, when actually there's a better way.
Yes.
And his name is Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. And you don't need to, I think, particularly if anyone's listening to this that is feeling like, oh, maybe you're curious but you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, I think the thing I would just say is, like, you don't need to smarten up, you don't need to know the Bible back to back, you don't have to have all the religious language, you just need to be open. You just have to be open. And I think if you're sensing that, the best prayer I often find is, Lord, I'm here, and if you're real, would you show me, and just that opening, beginning to open your life up to Jesus, the best thing you'll ever do. And
Yeah, fantastic. And you're going to introduce your next song.
Yeah, so this is a song called You Are My Country, by a band called Gable Price and Friends, who are amazing if you haven't heard of them. But I love this song because it's basically a critique of all of the labels and the barriers that we put up, even in the church and in the wider world, to create enemies of each other, and just saying, look, this stuff doesn't matter. Actually, our home is in God. And he's our unity, and he's where our allegiance lies. So yeah, here we go. You Are My Country.
Thank you. And my guest today is George White. And George, I'm loving your passion for Jesus. But I love the fact that you still have your passion for music. So tell us a little bit about some of the songs you've released and recorded.
Yeah, so I still write music under Trev, as I mentioned earlier, and so I started releasing music in 2016, and I did my first record is called Monk Days, and then in 2018 I did an EP called Self Other, and then another EP I think it was released in lockdown actually, called I Have Hope, and then most recently, so November 2024, I released the most recent record, which is called Second Mountain. And so they're all, all of the songs are just about life and faith. I heard a while ago now a quote from Nietzsche, of all people, who apparently, when he was talking about the music of Bach, he said, one who has forgotten Christianity completely hears it again as gospel in the music of Bach. And I, by no means right now, I'm comparing myself to Bach. Just let's make that clear. But that is my prayer for the music, that those who maybe wouldn't usually walk inside a church, wouldn't call themselves Christians, that they would hear the gospel afresh through the music and the words. So you can find that. This is so funny, isn't it? The little plugs. You can find that at all the usual places, Apple Music and Spotify and all of that kind of stuff. But I just hope that if anyone's interested, that blesses you. And yeah, I mean, like I said, it's all about God. I mean, the big story of the universe is that, and this is kind of really the only story I'm interested in telling in various different ways, is that there's a God. He's real and he's good. And he loves us, and we're made to know him. And despite our propensity to want to live life our own way, he chases after us. He doesn't leave us in the lurch. He doesn't sort of get fed up with us, but he comes and he chases us, and he longs to know us. And that's who Jesus is. That's what that's all about, is that God comes, he takes on flesh, and pursues us because he loves us so much. And ultimately, he loves us to the point of death. His love isn't just sentimental. It's not airy-fairy. His love leads him to dying for us. So all of our shame, all of our sin, all of our brokenness, all of the things that get in the way of our relationship with God can be dealt with, and we can be a new creation, and we can come alive again. And what's so amazing about it is that, not only does it bring us back into relationship with God, but there's this promise that God is going to make the world itself new. And I don't know about you, I look at the news at the moment, I'm like, oh my gosh, we need someone who's going to renew the world. And Jesus' promise is that one day he's going to come back and every tear will be wiped away and all mourning and suffering will be gone. And he'll make all things new. And that is the hope that I cling on to. And as Han Solo says in Star Wars The Force Awakens, it's true, all of it. And that's all I want to share. And I would just say, even now, if you're listening to this and you're open to that, just open yourself up to the Lord, and you can invite him in. Even now, you don't, like I said earlier, you don't need to have any background in church. You could be at the lowest of low, or you could be somewhere in between that, and you can know him even today. And you just open your heart to him. Jesus, if you're real, I thank you that you know me. I thank you that you love me, and I don't want to live life my own way anymore. Sorry for the things that I've done. Thank you that you died for me, and I just want to follow you now and invite you into my life, and it'll be the best decision you ever make.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. I'm a little older than you, George, and I can testify, having made that decision as a teenager, what amazing life. What an adventure. So, George, I can't thank you enough. I mean, just hearing your story is so inspiring and so encouraging. And I'd want to say thank you. Thank you for giving your time today. It's been an absolute delight, an absolute pleasure. And would you just introduce your final song for us?
Absolutely, and I've loved it. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been so fun. This final song's my favourite ever hymn. It's called "Come Thou Fount." The official title was "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and this is the King's Kaleidoscope version of that.
Thank you.
Close Encounters on Cross Rhythms. True stories, real people.